I heard her voice before I even fully woke up. It was 2047 in the morning. I know because I looked at the clock on my nightstand, the same cheap digital one I've had since before my daughter was born, and the red numbers were the first thing I saw when the phone pulled me out of sleep. The second thing I saw was her name on the screen. My daughter. Calling at 2:47 in the morning. I didn't think. I just picked up. Dad. That was all she said. Just that one word. But I've known that voice for 31 years. I changed her diapers. I held her hand on her first day of kindergarten. I walked her down the aisle 4 years ago, and I cried in the parking lot afterward because I thought I was losing her. I know every pitch and shade of that voice, and what I heard in that single syllable told me everything I needed to know before she said another word. She was terrified. "I'm here," I said. I was already sitting up, already reaching for my jeans on the chair by the bed. "Talk to me, sweetheart." There was a long pause. I could hear her breathing, shallow and fast, like she'd been running or like she was trying very hard not to cry. "Dad, I need you to come get me." "Where are you?" Another pause. Then, quieter. "I'm at the house." She meant her in-laws' house. She and her husband had been staying there for 6 weeks. They'd sold their condo in April and were waiting on a new place to close. It was supposed to be temporary. It had been anything but. I asked her if she was okay. She didn't answer the question. She just said, "Please come, Dad, please." I didn't call the police. I didn't call her brother. I grabbed my keys off the hook by the garage door, started my truck, and drove. I've lived in the same town in central Ohio my whole life, 53 minutes from my house to the Whitmore property. That's what I always called it in my head, even after my daughter married their son. The Whitmore property. Never home. Never where my daughter lived. It was a big colonial on 12 acres out past the reservoir, the kind of place that has a name on the mailbox instead of a number. Hawthorne Hill. I always thought that was a little much for Ohio. I drove the whole way with the phone on the seat beside me. She'd said she'd wait. She'd sounded like she meant it. But I kept glancing at it anyway, the way you do when you're afraid. I turned off my headlights when I got to their road. Don't ask me why. Instinct, maybe. Or maybe some part of me already knew that if I gave them warning, I'd lose whatever small advantage I had. I pulled up to the gate. They had an iron gate, because of course they did, and it was standing open, which surprised me. I drove through slow and parked on the side of the circular driveway, far enough from the front door that I could see the whole front of the house. Every light on the ground floor was on. I got out of the truck and walked to the front door and knocked. I didn't ring the bell. I don't know why. I just knocked 3 times, firm. The woman who opened the door was not my daughter. She was my daughter's mother-in-law. I'd met her a dozen times over 4 years of holidays and graduations and the occasional dinner. She always wore silk blouses and spoke like she was being recorded. She had the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. That night she was in a bathrobe, but her posture was perfect, and she looked at me the way you look at a delivery driver who's come to the wrong address. "Mr. Aldridge," she said, "do you have any idea what time it is?" "I do," I said. "Where's my daughter?" "Your daughter is asleep. She called me 20 minutes ago. She asked me to come get her." Something moved behind her eyes, just for a second. She was having a difficult night. She's been under a great deal of stress. She took something to help her sleep, and she's fine now. There's no reason for you to be here. I looked past her into the house. The foyer was lit up bright as noon and empty. The staircase curved up to the second floor on the right. I could hear nothing from upstairs. Nothing at all. "I'd like to see her," I said. "She's resting. Then I'll wait until she wakes up." The woman's expression didn't change, but her hand moved on the doorframe, not gripping it, just resting her fingers there. a reminder that she was the one holding the door. I don't think that's a good idea. It's the middle of the night and you're upset. I understand that. But your daughter is safe and she's not leaving. Not at 3 in the morning. Not like this. She's not leaving. 4 words. Said in the same tone you'd use to tell someone the kitchen is closed. I stood there for a moment looking at this woman who had stood beside me at my daughter's wedding reception and clinked her champagne glass against mine and said she was so glad our families were joined. I tried to find something in her face, some crack, some flicker of actual human concern. There was nothing, just that smooth, practiced patience. I want to speak with my daughter directly, I said. That's not going to happen tonight. I put my hand on the door. She didn't move. If you force your way into this house, she said, very quietly, I will call the police and have you arrested for trespassing. My son has connections with the county sheriff's office. I would encourage you to think carefully. Her son. I knew about the connections. Her husband, before he died 3 years ago, had been a major donor to half the county's elected officials. Her son had continued that tradition. It wasn't a secret. It was practically a selling point. I thought about that for exactly a selling point. I thought about that for exactly 4 seconds. Then I pushed the door open and walked in. She shouted something behind me. I didn't hear the words. I was already moving toward the staircase, calling my daughter's name. My voice sounded strange in that big open foyer, bouncing off the marble tile and the high ceiling. I called her again. Nothing. I went up the stairs faster than a 62-year-old man with bad knees has any business going upstairs. The second-floor hallway was dark except for a nightlight near the bathroom, 4 doors. I called her name again. Still nothing. I tried the first door, a linen closet. The second, a guest room, empty and neatly made up. The third was locked. I knocked on it. Sweetheart, it's Dad. I'm right here. Can you open the door? Nothing. I knocked harder. Honey, I need to hear your voice, please. I pressed my ear to the door and heard something that stopped my heart. It wasn't her voice. It was a sound, a soft, irregular sound, like breathing that wasn't quite right. I stepped back and I kicked that door. I'm not a big man. I'm 5'10", 170 pounds on a good day, and the last time I did anything athletic was a 5K. I walked with my wife before she passed. But I kicked that door with everything I had, and it took 3 tries, and on the 3rd try, the frame splintered and the door swung open, and I went in. She was on the floor beside the bed. She was wearing the sweatshirt from her old college, the grey one with the cracked letters on the front. She was curled on her side with her knees pulled up. Her face was turned toward the door. Her eyes were closed. I was beside her in 2 steps. I said her name and touched her face, and she made a small sound like someone hearing you from very far away, and I felt something loosen in my chest. She was alive. She was breathing. And then I looked at her arms. There were bruises on both forearms. Not from falling. I know what a fall bruise looks like. These were grip bruises. Fingers, 4 on one side, thumb on the other. I'm going to stop here and tell you something. I am not a violent man. I have never hit another person in my adult life. I coached Little League for 11 years, and I never raised my voice at a kid. I am, by every measure, a calm person. But when I saw those bruises, I felt something move through me that I don't have a clean word for. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something older and colder than that. Something that understood for a moment exactly what it would mean to be the kind of man who does what was done to my daughter. I called 911. I told them I needed an ambulance, and I gave them the address. The woman from downstairs appeared in the doorway behind me and started saying things about me being a criminal, about trespassing, about what her son would do, and I turned around and looked at her, and she stopped talking. The ambulance took 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, I sat on the floor next to my daughter and held her hand and talked to her. I told her I was there. I told her she was safe. I told her the same things I told her when she was small and had bad dreams, and I don't know if she could hear me, but she squeezed my hand once near the end, and I took that as enough. The paramedics came, then the police. I stepped back and let them work. Then one of the officers walked over to me and told me I was being detained. They put me in the back of a patrol car. Not handcuffed, detained, they said. They needed to sort out what had happened. Standard procedure. I sat in the back of that car and watched through the window while they brought my daughter out on a stretcher and loaded her into the ambulance. And I watched the rear doors close, and I watched the ambulance drive away down the long gravel driveway with its lights going, and then it was gone, and I was still sitting there. One of the officers came back to the car. Young guy, maybe 28. He had the look of someone who'd been given instructions he wasn't entirely comfortable with. Sir, the homeowner is saying you forced your way in. I did, I said. She's saying you broke a door. I did that too. He shifted his weight. She wants to press charges, breaking and entering, criminal trespassing. I looked at him. My daughter was unconscious on the floor of a locked room. She called me 2 hours ago and asked me to come get her. I have the call on my phone. I'm happy to show you. I paused. Is she going to be okay? He looked at his notebook. The paramedics said she's stable. Good, I said. Now, are you going to charge me with something, or can I go to the hospital? He went away to talk to someone. I sat in that car for 40 minutes. I watched the lights in the house. I watched a second patrol car pull up and 2 more officers go inside. At some point, a man in a sport coat arrived, not in uniform, and went straight to the front door without talking to anyone. I didn't know who he was then. I found out later. Eventually, the young officer came back and opened my door and said I was free to go, but not to leave the county and that there might be further questions. I thanked him. I drove to the hospital. My daughter's name is Sylvia. She is 31 years old and she has her mother's eyes and her grandmother's stubbornness. And she has been, from the day she was born, the thing in my life that I am most certain I got right. She was awake when I got to the hospital. Barely, but awake. She was in a bed with the rail up and an IV in her arm, and when I walked in, she looked at me, and her face did something complicated, and she said, "You came." Of course I came, I said. I sat beside her for a long time. She slept and woke and slept again. Somewhere around 6 in the morning she was alert enough to talk. She told me things that I am not going to repeat here in detail, because they are hers to carry and share if and when she chooses to. What I will say is that it had been going on for a long time, longer than I knew, and that she had been afraid for longer than I knew, and that the night she called me, she had been locked in that room for 11 hours. 11 hours. I sat with that for a while. I am a retired man. I spent 34 years doing commercial property appraisals, which is about as unglamorous as it sounds. I am not wealthy. I am not connected. I do not have a lawyer on retainer or an in with the county sheriff. What I have is time and stubbornness and the particular kind of rage that a father carries quietly for years until he needs it. I called my brother-in-law that morning. He's a civil attorney, not criminal, but he knew people. He made calls. By that afternoon, I had the name of a family law attorney in Columbus who'd handled cases like this before, and by the following morning, she and I were sitting across a table from each other. Her name was Mrs. Faber. She was in her late 50s, grey-haired, and had the manner of someone who'd heard every variation of every terrible story and had stopped being shocked but never stopped caring. She listened. She asked questions. She made notes in a yellow legal pad. At the end, she looked up and said, "Do you have photos of your daughter's injuries?" I did. I'd taken them in the hospital with her permission. She nodded. The locked room is important. The 11 hours is important. The fact that she called you and then couldn't be reached is important. She tapped her pen on the pad. The breaking and entering charge, that's a problem, but it's manageable. Given the circumstances, a good DA is not going to want to take that to trial. What about his connections? I asked. The county connections. She gave me a look. Mr. Aldridge, she said, that's why you hire a Columbus attorney. What followed was not fast, and it was not clean, and it was not the kind of thing that wraps up neatly. I want to be honest about that. There were weeks where I wasn't sure of anything. There were phone calls I dreaded making and some I dreaded receiving even more. My son-in-law's attorney sent a letter that was designed, I think, to make me feel small and powerless. It mostly worked for about a day, and then I gave it to Mrs. Nis. Faber, and she told me what it actually meant in plain English, which was less than it sounded. Sylvia moved in with me. She slept in her old room, the one that still had the bookshelf she built with me in high school, and for the first 2 weeks she mostly slept and didn't talk much, and I made her soup and didn't push. Her husband came to my house once, stood in the driveway and asked to talk to her. I stepped out onto the porch and told him she didn't want to see him and he should speak to her attorney. He stood there for a minute, looking at me like he was trying to decide something. Then he left. His mother called 3 times. I answered the first time. She told me I had misunderstood what I saw, that Sylvia had always been fragile, that the family only wanted what was best for her. I listened to all of it. When she finished, I said, "Don't call this number again," and I hung up. She called twice more. I didn't answer. The photograph evidence mattered. The phone records mattered. The testimony of the paramedic who treated Sylvia mattered enormously. He'd noted the bruise patterns in his report, and his professional opinion as to their likely cause was not favorable to my son-in-law. There was also, eventually, a neighbor. A woman who lived a quarter-mile down the road and had heard things on 2 previous occasions and had not known who to tell. She came forward. She gave a statement. The county connections, it turned out, only extended so far when there was a paper trail. The charge against me, breaking and entering, was dropped. The DA's office cited extenuating circumstances. Mrs. Moss, Faber, said that was a diplomatic way of saying they didn't want the story of a 62-year-old man being prosecuted for rescuing his unconscious daughter to end up on the front page of anything. The divorce was finalized in February. Sylvia got what she was entitled to. Her husband moved out of state. His mother sold Hawthorne Hill 6 months later. I heard it through town. I didn't dwell on it. People ask me sometimes, now that enough time has passed to talk about it, whether I regret not calling the police first. Honestly, I've turned that question over 100 times, and the truth is more complicated than a yes or a no. If I'd called 911 from my driveway, I don't know what would have happened. The family had a history with the county. The call might have gone differently. The officer who showed up might have knocked politely, been told my daughter was fine, and left. These are not hypotheticals. This is how it has gone in other families, in other towns, and I am not naive enough to pretend otherwise. What I know is that when I kicked in that door, she was still breathing. And I know that the sound I heard through that door, that wrong, shallow sound, was not the sound of someone sleeping off medication. Whatever was happening in that room, time mattered. But I'll also say this. I got lucky. Lucky that the young officer who detained me had a conscience. Lucky that the DA's office had enough political sense to see which way the wind was blowing. Lucky that the neighbor came forward. You can do everything right or everything desperate and still have it go the other way. The difference is often just luck. So no, I don't regret it, but I also don't recommend it as a strategy. What I recommend is this. If your child calls you at 2047 in the morning and says, "Come get me," you go, you figure out everything else later, you go. Sylvia has her own apartment now, about 20 minutes from my house. She has a job she likes and a cat she named after a character in a book I gave her when she was 12. She comes for dinner on Sundays, usually, and sometimes she stays late, and we watch old movies the way we used to when she was in high school, and her mother was still alive, and the three of us would pile onto the couch with popcorn and argue about which one to put on. She laughs now, not all the time, and not the same laugh as before, but she laughs. Last fall, she asked me to teach her to make her grandmother's pot roast, the real version, with the dried mushrooms and the half a bottle of red wine that my mother always put in and never admitted to. We spent a whole Saturday afternoon in my kitchen, the two of us, and we made a mess of it the first time and got it mostly right the second time and ate it at the kitchen table with a bottle of something decent and talked for 3 hours. On her way out, she hugged me at the door, the way she has since she was small with her whole self, and she said, "Thanks, Dad." I said, "For the pot roast?" She smiled. "For everything." I stood on the porch and watched her taillights disappear down the street, and then I went back inside and I washed the dishes and I went to bed. And for the first night in a long time, I slept just fine. I've had a lot of time to sit with everything that happened. More time than I expected, honestly. When you're in the middle of it, when you're in the back of a patrol car watching an ambulance carry your daughter away, you don't think about lessons. You don't think about anything except the next 10 minutes. But eventually the dust settles and the quiet comes back and you start to understand what the whole thing was actually about. What I keep coming back to is this. The people who hurt Sylvia weren't monsters in the way we usually picture monsters. They were ordinary people who'd spent years making small choices to look away, to stay quiet, to protect the family name instead of the person standing right in front of them. And those small choices, stacked one on top of another over months and years, became something large enough to put my daughter on a floor at 2 in the morning. That's how it usually works. Not one dramatic evil act, just a long series of quiet ones. I think about the neighbor who finally came forward. She'd heard things. She'd known, in the way people know things they don't want to fully acknowledge, that something was wrong at that house. And she'd stayed quiet, not out of malice, but out of the very human desire to not get involved, to not be wrong, to not make things worse. I don't blame her for that. I understand it. But I also think about what might have been different if she'd made a different choice 6 months earlier. That's the weight of silence. It doesn't feel like a decision when you're making it. It only feels like one later. The thing about integrity. And I don't mean that word in some grand, formal sense. I just mean doing the right thing when it costs you something, is that it has to be practiced before you need it. I didn't know that night was coming. Nobody does. But I knew, in some part of myself I couldn't have named if you'd asked me, that if that moment ever arrived, I was going to move toward my daughter, not away. That wasn't courage in the moment. That was just the accumulation of every smaller decision I'd made over 62 years about what kind of man I wanted to be. And Sylvia, what she did took more than I can fully express. She made that call from a locked room in the dark, not knowing if I'd get there in time, not knowing what would happen when I did. She chose, against everything that fear tells you to do, to ask for help. That is not a small thing. There is a kind of intelligence in knowing when to reach out, a wisdom that has nothing to do with books or degrees. And she had it even in the worst moment of her life. What I want to say to anyone listening who recognizes something in this story is that the help has to be asked for and it has to be answered. Both sides of that matter equally. You cannot wait for someone to figure out that you're in trouble. And if someone reaches out to you at 2 a.m. at any hour, in whatever form that takes, you go. You sort out the details later. You go. The woman who blocked that door believed she had power over the situation. She had money and connections and a practiced calm that was designed to make other people feel small. But none of that survived contact with a simple fact. My daughter asked me to come, and I came and I kept coming, through every obstacle they put in the way. That's not power in any complicated sense. It's just stubbornness in service of the right thing. And in my experience, that is almost always enough.